My name is Donald Kirkley, and my association with H.L. Mencken goes back to my connection with the Baltimore Sun, which began in 1920. What you're about to hear is, to the best of my knowledge, the only recording of his voice ever made, except for a few transcripts of radio broadcasts which were not preserved. On June 30th, 1948, at the request of the Library of Congress, I persuaded Mr. Mencken to come to Washington for this interview. He was a somewhat reluctant witness, having a deep distrust of microphones, and he agreed to come only after I had baited the hook with the statement that his voice was to be saved for posterity. Because we wanted this to be a natural record, we did no rehearsing. He didn't know what questions were to be asked, and I made them up as we went along. So you're actually eavesdropping on an informal conversation following natural lines, and hearing Mr. Mencken speak just as his friends and associates heard him day after day. You will notice that his voice seems a little tired, and that there are some signs of the recurrence of his annual affliction, hay fever. He had reported a political convention for the Sun and had not quite recovered from the fatigue. During the recording, I mentioned the fact jokingly that what we were putting on tape might be heard by people 1,000 years hence. At the time, Mr. Mencken seemed to pay no attention to this, but on the way home he was thoughtful for a few moments, and then he said, "Do you really think that people will be listening to this 1,000 years from now?" I said, "Well, Henry, I hope so, for my sake as well as yours." The recording was made in a small room at the library on a warm day in June, and I now gladly turn over the microphone to Mr. Mencken, who was sitting opposite me, chewing his favorite cigar with some belligerence and looking somewhat like a literary lion at bay. Well, we're on the air. Henry?
Air? We're not on the air.
Well,
we're on the platter.
Let's call it hot air.
Yeah,
That's right. I'm a little confused after that ride over from Baltimore. Did you ever see such a hideous boulevard in your life?
I suppose there are boulevards just as terrible, but I'd never seen any. No. It's a disgrace to humanity without question.
Why?
Well, because it represents the American lust for the hideous, the delight in ugliness for its own sake. It's very appropriately, it leads to the capital of the United States.
I remember you were using that phrase quite often when you wrote for the Sun papers, the American libido for the ugly.
Yeah.
That was a favorite topic.
Yeah. Well, the idea in that was this, that such horrible exhibitions are not due to mere ignorance and innocence. There is a positive delight in the ugly. You can, if you go down the street in Baltimore in those endless rows of two-story houses on a summer night, you can look in them. They're usually illuminated more or less. And you'll notice you'll go sometimes for 2 or 3 blocks without seeing a single object that's not hideous. Not a single thing. Not even a picture on the wall or a carpet or a rug. Then all of a sudden, you'll see in even the meanest neighborhoods a house very tastefully decorated.
Such as your house at 1524 Holland?
No, mine is not one, but there is a colored woman that lived in the alley behind me who in a little 4-room house did a swell job of decorating. I don't know who she was or what became of her. She's finally disappeared. But she had this little house beautifully decorated with simple means. Cheap, but good. The color scheme was good, and the arrangement of things was good. Now, what that signifies, I don't know. I haven't decided.
You were born in one of those 2-story row houses, weren't you?
Yeah, I was born in Lexington Street in Baltimore near Fremont.
And you still live in one of those 2-story houses?
No, it's a 3-story.
3-story, well...
It was 3-story, the one I was born into. My father bought the house I'm at present living in 1883.
It's a mark of great success in a Baltimorean when he's born in a 2-story house and works up to live in a 3-story house.
Yes, yeah, that is, but I had, unfortunately, didn't come up from that log cabin. My misfortune was that my father was relatively well off. It's been a curse to me all my life. Nobody will believe me on that ground. It seems to be the idea in America that no man is worth listening to unless he's had some experience in sweatshops. No, I'm all right.
What are your earliest recollections of Baltimore as a boy?
Well, I've written a book describing them. My first recollection is of the Oriole Parade in Baltimore in 1883. I've been told by psychologists and other such frauds that you couldn't possibly recollect anything that early. I was 3 years old precisely. But I remember it. I recall it very distinctly. And it wasn't told to me. Baltimore, I knew as a boy, was extraordinarily hot in summer and filthy. It was full of flies, mosquitoes. All kinds of epidemics were running simultaneously. But the people liked it. Food was cheap. Houses were comfortable, although we slept under mosquito nets. And I look back on it with great affection. I realized its limitations. There were no sewers, and water supply was bad. Typhoid raged all summer, smallpox all winter, malaria at all times of the year. I had malaria, but I escaped typhoid and smallpox. How, I don't know. I think I escaped smallpox by a vaccination. The family doctor, old Dr. Wiley, vaccinated me when I was about 2 years old, and the scar was so enormous that it's still big as a $50 on my arm, and no vaccination that I've ever had since has taken, as they say. I've been told that that's no proof of anything, but nevertheless, there is the fact.
What schools did you go to?
I went to a school kept by an old German named Friedrich Knapp, known to Americans as Knapp. The school was down in Holiday Street, where the War Memorial is now. And it was a private school. I went there till I was 12 years old, and then I transferred to Polytechnic.
That's a high school.
Yeah. I never got beyond the Polytechnic. I graduated at the Polytechnic very early. I was only 15. And never went to school since, thank God. Most men that escaped college have a regret that pursues them. But I must confess I'm much too vain to have any such regrets. I think of what I was doing when the boys of my generation were in college, listening to idiot lectures and cheering football games and doing all the foolish and silly and useless things that college boys do. I was a young reporter on the street, and I believe...
How old?
18. I believe that a young newspaper reporter in a big city at that time led a life that has never been matched on earth for romance and interest.
Well, the general belief is that you were a born reporter, and I believe there's an interesting story as to how you got your first job.
No, the story's not interesting. I simply applied for it and got it. I never was a good reporter.
Well, you see, already there are legends. The legends are that you offered to work for nothing and went out and came back with some big feature story.
No, I never got a scoop in my life. They were the things that were esteemed in those days. They never seemed to me to have any sense. Most scoops were bad stories, and they were always exaggerated and played up in an idiot manner. No, I wasn't a good reporter, except in one sense, that I worked. I was willing to work. I never shirked the job.
With what papers did you work?
I started with the Baltimore Herald, and that was the end of my experience as a reporter, because I became a Sunday editor very early, at 23, and a city editor right afterwards.
What paper?
Same Herald.
Same Herald.
And hence, I did very little reporting after the age of 25. In later years, I went back to reporting as a kind of volunteer, but I did only things that were